Before commencing today, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land of which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Kathy and I'm pleased to welcome local author Garry Linnell to present his latest release, Moonlight, a unique narrative of Captain Moonlight and the dying days of bushrangers. Garry is a Central Coast local and he visited our Umina branch last year when touring with his bestseller, Buckley's Chance, his first Australian history book. He's also written 3 other books with a more sporting focus: Football Limited, The Inside Story of the AFL; Raylene, Sometimes Beaten, Never Conquered; Playing God, The Rise and Fall of Gary Ablett. Garry Linnell is one of Australia's most experienced journalists. He's won several awards for his writing, including a Walkley for Best Feature Writing. He has been Editor-in-Chief of The Bulletin, Editor of The Daily Telegraph, Director of News and Current Affairs for the Nine Network, and Editorial Director of Fairfax. He's also spent 4 years as a co-host on The Breakfast Show on 2UE, and he'll be presenting for about 30 minutes for us today. So please join me in welcoming Garry.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you everyone for logging in today. I'd much rather be having a chat with you in person at the library, but unfortunately we can't do that. Hopefully soon. Hopefully you'll see me around the Central Coast over the next few weeks, because I'm always popping into one of the libraries I'm not doing some research. I often tell people that a lot of Australians seem almost embarrassed by our own history. And I often say it's a little bit like that uncle who turns up on your front door at, on Christmas Day wearing a very loud shirt, and a couple of hours later he's lying, snoring on the couch with a lampshade over his head. There is a sense of embarrassment about our history. It's a very short history, since white settlement at least anyway. And we don't celebrate our history enough, I don't think. And when you do go through it, I mean, when I went to high school in Geelong in Victoria, I used to sit at the back of the class and I used to find it quite a dull affair. And I used to wonder, why don't they tell us the stories about the characters who helped form and create this country? Why is it always told in such a, I guess, a white British sort of Anglo viewpoint? Anyway, so the first history lesson today with Captain Moonlight is understanding, I think, the time and place and the context in which he lived and died. I grew up reading about bushrangers. I think in the 60s and 70s, a lot of kids did. There was always an almanac that seemed to come out every second month that always listed the exploits and the feats of the bushrangers. But when I used to go through those books, there was hardly ever a mention of this Captain Moonlight. His real name was Andrew George Scott. And a couple of years ago, and I was talking to the publishers at Penguin, we were discussing whether or not to do a book on Moonlight. And the more I dug into his background, the more I was astonished at why he had sort of disappeared from history's pages. And I think there's a reason for that, and I'll get to it very shortly. But first, a little bit of context. We're dealing with the 1870s and 1880s. So Australia, since white settlement, is barely a century old. And the world is in the grip of what's called the second industrial revolution. And it was probably had far more impact on the planet than the first one did. In Germany, you had a guy with a very distinctive loopy moustache called Karl Benz, who was tinkering away in a small tin factory in Mannheim. And he was playing with a 2-stroke engine that would later very quickly become the very first motor car in the world. Across the ocean in Canada, you had a man called Alexander Graham Bell, who was in a small shed on a farm that he was living on. And he was experimenting with ways of transmitting his voice using electrical impulses that would soon become the telephone. Further south in the United States, you had an inventor who was already incredibly well known called Thomas Edison. He'd invented the phonograph, transformed the way that people would listen to music and sound. And he was now experimenting with a long-lasting light bulb that would eventually and very quickly light up the world. He had a problem with trying to figure out how he could get it to glow for a long time. and that was the problem with the filament. So he actually borrowed the whisker of a friend's beard and tried to use that, and then experimented with banana skins and finally settled on a piece of treated cotton. And that was the very first long-lasting light globe that would light up the Earth, so it would be even seen from space. So you had all of these massive changes, and one of the other big changes had been the introduction in the 1870s of the telegraph, the electric telegraph. And suddenly Australia was no longer affected as much by that famous tyranny of distance. You had what I've described in the book as almost like a series of crosses on the Appian Way, thousands of these telegraph poles stretching right across the middle of the country. And they connected Australia to the rest of the world. Until they'd arrived, Australia used to have to wait months, 3-4 months before the mail arrived. I think you may momentarily lost me there.
Yeah, yeah.
It was just I think there's an issue with some computers sometimes. And so they'd often have to wait for several months at a time for the ships to arrive to bring the mail and the news from Europe out. Suddenly, it was here within 12 hours. So communication had greatly increased. And what this had done was eliminate or eventually kill the bush telegraph. Now, the bush telegraph was essentially a man on a very tired horse going from town to town, taking the mail, taking months-old newspapers into outlying regions and letting everyone know what was happening. And word would spread and people would pass on the news, but sometimes it would take days or weeks. But what the Bush Telegraph also did was protect Australia's bushrangers, these outlaws who had been roaming its outlying districts ever since the 1810s, 1820s. A lot of them were escaped convicts, had no idea how to cope with the Australian bush, but they managed to find a way. They robbed outlying farmhouses, and they became a real nuisance. There were no, I guess, formal police forces in either the colony of New South Wales or Victoria, not until about the 1860s, 1870s. And they were actually formed in part to answer this ongoing problem with the bushrangers, who were sort of roaming at will and not just robbing people, but murdering them as well. And by the 1870s, they'd become a real embarrassment to the colonies. In 1867, Queen Victoria had sent her second son, Prince Alfred, out to the colonies on the very first royal tour. And Australia was very keen to impress the mother country. They wanted to show how much they'd sort of grown up and matured and were no longer suffering the so-called convict stain. It had been an embarrassing trip in the end because the prince was a known womanizer. He was visiting brothels, he was drunk half the time, and he was also the victim of an assassination attempt by an Irishman who walked up to him at a picnic at Clontarf on the northern beaches there of Sydney and shot him from behind. Unfortunately, he was wearing a very thick pair of suspenders, and the bullet managed to be deflected, and he was treated by nurses and survived. But they were horrified, and the Irish, because of that, there was an enormous backlash against the Irish by the late 1860s. Sir Henry Parkes was threatening to pull the funding from any Irish Catholic schools. And into this environment, off a gangplank of a ship down at Woolloomooloo, stepped Andrew George Scott. Now, he was a very unlikely bushranger. He was born in 1845 in a small Northern Ireland town called Rathfreeland. His father was the local justice of the peace there. Among his many jobs, they lived in a very large manor on the top of a hill. 1845 was a very interesting year in Ireland and for Australia. Not only was Captain Moonlight born, but a few months later, the spores of a virus began seeping through the soil and began infecting what was called the lumper potato, which was the key food source for millions of the Irish poor. And the famine resulted. And for the next 4 to 5 years, more than 2 to 3 million Irish people died. Many of them were actually buried with green stains around their mouth because they were so hungry that they'd started eating the grass beneath their feet. It was the only food they could find. There wasn't a shortage of food. The English overlords who were running Ireland at the time, they had thousands of acres of beautiful pastures, they had cattle, but all of it was destined for the larders of London. And they decided not to sort of divert it and give it to the people who actually had been living in that country for tens of thousands of years. So there was clearly, it was a key part of the growing hatred between the Irish and the English. Andrew George's Scott's father, Thomas, who was a justice of the peace, one of his many jobs was to settle a lot of the feuds between the Catholics and the Protestants there. But he enjoyed a life of luxury. He was taught the classics. He was taught some of the great poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge. He was sent at the age of 14 to become a cadet with the British Navy in London, and he spent 18 months there on the training ship Britannica. But by the late 1850s, the English had changed the system of justices of the peace. There was also a problem with the family's savings. They'd all gone. And they were forced to emigrate to survive. And so New Zealand, the colony of New Zealand at the time in 1860 was offering prospective immigrants from England the chance to come out. They'd give them a 40-acre parcel of land and 40 quid, which was a huge sum of money back then. So the Scott family headed off to New Zealand. They arrived. By the time he was 18, Andrew had joined the Waikato military. Now, we'll call him George from now on because that's what all of his friends called him. He was George Scott from then on. He joined the local Waikato military and fought in several of the key battles in what became known as the New Zealand Wars, where the colonists were at war with the local Maori. Quite vicious battles, many of them. George was shot several times, once in the foot and higher up in the leg and the shoulder, badly injured there for a time. And when the war was over, he applied to become a policeman in New Zealand, was rejected. And I think fed up with where he saw his life was going nowhere, decided to come to Australia. Now, even though the Scott family had enjoyed a fair bit of privilege over in Ireland, the locals always said that there was a strain of madness running through their blood as well. And indeed, on the ship that took them to New Zealand, some of the crew remembered young George Scott as being not quite right. He'd be quite complimentary and had a nice personality, but then for days on end, he would go off the deep end and start yelling or talking to himself. And they found this quite disturbing. Mental illness was a pretty unknown science back in those times. People were just dismissed as being insane. But I think now we would probably assume that he was either suffering from schizophrenia or some sort of mental disability that affected his life. And you'll understand why as we get further into his story. He arrived in Australia in 1868 and left Sydney almost immediately and went to Melbourne with friends of the family who were involved in the Anglican Church, managed to secure an interview for him with the Archbishop of Melbourne. And he was quite impressed with George Scott. He was also desperate for lay readers, preachers, to get out into the countryside. This was the tail end of the gold rush, and the population of New South Wales and Victoria had absolutely soared in the previous 10 years. And they couldn't cope with the number of people who wanted to go to their churches. They didn't have enough preachers out there. So Andrew George Scott, he was dashing, charismatic, beautiful public speaker. He was sent out. He first went to the small town of Bacchus Marsh. He then arrived at the small mining town of Mount Egerton, just north of Ballarat, which had been obviously central to the Victorian gold rush in the 1850s. And he befriended a young man there called Jules Brune with a Danish background. And he was a young man who was in charge of the local London Chartered Bank there. And quite often through his life, George Scott formed very close relationships with young men. He seemed, I think they were drawn to him. He had his Irish patter. He was a great storyteller. He had already been in several adventures. So he was able to draw in a crowd and hold them with his way of speaking. And they were very close there for about a month. And then one night, Jules Brune was closing up the bank when he felt a gun nuzzled at the back of his neck, and a man with a black crepe mask and a large hat and a cape said, "Open the bank." And this man took about £1,000 worth of gold nuggets and cash, and he left a note saying that the bank had been robbed by Captain Moonlight. And that's where the legend eventually came from. The young man was actually charged with the robbery. He got off during the trial. A lot of the suspicion centred on this young preacher who had been struggling. His father hadn't sent him any money for some time. He wasn't being paid very much by the Anglican Church, and he was heavily in debt. But no one could quite believe that the local lay reader of the Anglican Church would have held up the bank. But about 6 weeks after the robbery and the trial, George Scott left Victoria, jumped on a ship. He had a very large nugget of gold in his baggage, and he sailed with several men across to the Pacific to Fiji, where he went into business with them. He later fleeced them of quite a bit of money, their guns, and racked up considerable debts over there. And by late 1869, he sailed back through Sydney Heads and would spend the next year in Sydney spending that money. And he lived the high life. He rented rooms in Sydney in some of the finest hotels, bought himself outstanding clothes. He always had a sharp eye for great costumes. He was a cad, essentially, in that era, and a dandy, as they called them. But they eventually caught up with him. He was found passing fraudulent checks, and he was sentenced to 18 months in the Maitland prison. While he was there, he shammed or feigned mental illness and told them that he was being poisoned and he would only eat potatoes. He was sent to the Parramatta Asylum for a time, where they decided he was only faking it as well. He tried to stage several breakouts while he was there. He was obviously going through periods in his life when he would be seized by these ideals that he was either being followed or someone was coming after him. And he would go off the deep end. And I think that's what probably happened when he had actually robbed the bank at Mount Egerton as well. Anyway, after 18 months, he was released. And on the day that he was released, he was carrying with him a letter, a very long letter, 9 or 10 pages, to his father back in New Zealand. And it's quite a letter that will tug at your heartstrings. He says, "Dear Father, I'm feeling a lot better." So obviously there'd been some correspondence before that, which suggested he'd fallen ill and hadn't been feeling himself. But he starts rambling towards the end of the letter. His handwriting starts drunkenly slanting off to the right, and he starts talking about how the colony of New South Wales is an evil place and people are being murdered left, right and centre, and he needed to get out of there. He never got to send that letter. It was seized, and he was arrested on the day that he was released and charged with the murder, with the bank robbery back at Mount Egerton. He was transported back to Victoria and stood trial in Ballarat. Now, by the time he arrived down there, he was a huge name. This figure, Captain Moonlight, there were stories being written about him, and they were being transmitted on the telegraph all around the world. They appeared back in New Zealand, back in Ireland, back in London. The newspapers were running stories about him. Just a week before his trial was due to begin in Ballarat for that robbery, he staged this audacious breakout from the Ballarat prison. He took 6 other prisoners with him over the wall. It was a prison that was supposed to be escape-proof, but George Scott, among his many skills, had also been trained as an engineer back in New Zealand, and he had a good eye for, not just engineering, but architecture, and he'd seen several weaknesses in the doors of the prison. And so he was able to manage this escape. He was on the run for 10 days before he was recaptured. By the time he was recaptured, there were thousands of people flocking outside the prison to try and catch a glimpse of him. They were pushing and shoving on the train platform to see him arrive back in Ballarat. He was a celebrity. And his trial, he dismissed his local lawyer. The judge in the trial was Sir Redmond Barry, who would later, 10 years later, sentence Ned Kelly to death. And he ended up sending George Scott off to Pentridge, the stockade, for 10 years for robbing the Mount Egerton Bank. And it was there that George Scott arrived in 1872. He probably crossed paths with a young man who had a real chip on his shoulder, who came from the northeastern ridges and the heavy bush country of northern Victoria. His name was Ned Kelly, and he was doing a very short stint for stealing a horse. Now, we don't know if they truly met, but the dates match up. They were certainly in Pentridge for a time there. So they would have probably crossed paths in the prison yard. George Scott hated prison. He, from the very start, he was put into a bath, and he refused to get into it because there'd been 3 Chinamen and an Englishman who had been in it before him. He was at war with the authorities. But in 1875, 3 years after he'd been in Pentridge, something changed. He met a young man who became the love of his life. And to me, this is the key part of George Scott's story, the story of Captain Moonlight, because it also becomes, I think, one of the most tragic love stories in Australian history. James Nesbitt was a young man from the wrong side of the tracks. He had grown up in the pretty tough northern suburbs of Melbourne, in Carlton, the inner suburbs. He ran with some of the young street gangs, like the Bouverie Street Push, they were called. He was a petty thief, just like his father, who was an old drunk. James Nesbitt Sr. was a regular before the courts in Melbourne. He was often referred to just as the Brute by the local newspaper reporters because he was always there. He famously had locked his wife and children out of their house one summer's night when a big storm had hit the town and they were left drenched outside. He assaulted a policeman. He was always drunk, and he was always beating up his kids as well. And James, if you have a look at the photographs, he's got a boyish look to him. He's got jug ears, a little cleft chin, and when he was led into Pentridge in 1875 for 4 years because he robbed a local bakery, they found a few scars on his head, which were probably the result of a run-in with his father from time to time. Anyway, he met George Scott in there, and the two of them just hit it off. They were described by prison authorities as extraordinarily close, almost inseparable. And in fact, one stage they were separated by the authorities. James was actually had a sentence added to his a day added to his sentence when he broke the rules and took George Scott a cup of tea one day. So quite affecting transgressions, I guess, in his prison record, but it did show how close the two were. James was released from Pentridge first. George Scott followed him a few months later, and James was waiting for George outside the prison gates. By then, George Scott, or Captain Moonlight as he was known to the entire country, was ropeable. He'd spent 7 years. He got out on good behaviour. His sentence was shortened. But he was disgusted by what he'd seen. He had this notion. He was very much trained in the notion that you had to have honour and discipline. And what he saw in Pentridge had disgusted him. He thought people were sent to prison to be reformed. And yet the young mingled with the old. They came out worse than what they had been when they entered. There was no attempt to teach them anything, teach them a trade. So he went and George Scott hired himself a theatrical agent called Richard Thatcher, who had looked after the careers of many famous actors and actresses in Melbourne and Sydney, and set himself up as on the public speaking course. Now, back in the late 1870s, at night, if you wanted entertainment, you didn't sit down and watch Netflix or turn on the TV or listen to the radio. You would go to the local hotel or the local public hall or church, and a public lecture would be given. And George Scott had already given public lectures on engineering when he was in Bacchus Marsh and Mount Egerton. And I think they must have been incredibly tedious and boring because I've gone through the transcripts of some of them from the local newspapers, and you would have been yawning by the end of them. He loved to talk. He never met an audience that he didn't like. So he embarked on this public lecture series where he talked about how bad the reform system was in Victoria and how it needed to be fixed. He had a lot of cheek because he turned up at Mount Egerton and gave a speech there. He also spoke at the Unicorn Hotel in Ballarat, where 500 people crammed into the hotel, paid a penny each. And when he appeared, the room hushed. He was brilliantly dressed out. He had a handkerchief sticking out of the corner of his the pocket of his suit. Not a hair was out of place. He was scented with oils, with beautiful clothes, and he spoke incredibly well for almost 2 hours, never pausing. He would often quote the poets and break into a long monologue talking about his history in England and Ireland. So he kept them captivated. But there was only so many people, I guess, who wanted to hear these speeches. And he soon found it hard to make money. He tried looking for a job, but he found that the police in Victoria were constantly harassing him and James. And by then he sort of amassed, I guess, a following. It was called a gang, but it was just a group of young, broken men who had been drawn to him and his stories. One of them was Tom Rogan, a young man who'd also spent time in prison. He was trying to go straight. He was a bootmaker by trade. There was a young guy who was only 14, Gus Wernicke, whose father owned the local pub and one of the big pubs in Melbourne, and also the local brothel. And Moonlight had found him on the street, starving, his hair full of lice, and he brought him a meal and taken him up into his group. There was also a young guy called Thomas Williams, who he'd met in Ballarat, who was completely obsessed with bushrangers and criminals and was under the spell of Moonlight. So he promised these young men that they were not going to find any work in Melbourne because the police were going to make it too hard for them. So they would go to New South Wales and try and get a new start there. So they set out on foot. And that's why I say he was a very unlikely bushranger, Captain Moonlight. They didn't have horses, they had some guns. They walked from Melbourne, crossed all the way up to the Murray River, crossed over, headed to Gundagai, where they'd heard that at the Wantabadgery station, which was one of the largest sheep stations in the country, that any itinerant traveller could find work. And so they turned up, they were rejected, and Moonlight was humiliated. He was badly treated by the station manager. They went back and ended up laying siege to the station. Moonlight was going through one of his incredibly mad periods where in the end they ended up taking 40 hostages in this station. There were several shootouts with the police. James was shot through the temple during one of these shootouts. And as he lay dying on the ground, Moonlight cradled him in his arms and kissed him passionately all over his blood-smeared face as though he was trying to bring him back to life. And the police sat around watching this because by then the siege was over and they'd captured them, and laughed at the spectacle of one man kissing another man. Eventually, Moonlight was taken to Sydney to stand trial. One of the troopers during the shootout had been shot dead. He, along with 3 other members of the gang, were charged with the trooper's murder. And there was a hastily held trial. It was a fix from the start. No one knew whose bullet had actually killed the trooper. But it didn't really matter according to the laws at the time. But New South Wales was also determined to wipe out this stain of the bushrangers. They thought they were over it. The Captain Thunderbolts, all of those figures from the 1870s were long dead and had been long buried. And they hadn't had any bushranging episodes until Moonlight had come along. So anyway, the trial was held. The judge himself was actually the brother of the former station owner at Wantabadgery, which would never happen these days. There were a lot of problems with the process of the law. You can read about it in the book. But eventually he was sentenced to hang, he and Tom Rogan. And on the 20th of January, they walked onto the gallows at Darlinghurst Jail and confronted for the first time my favourite character in the book, the hangman, Nosy Bob. His real name was Robert Rice Howard. He had been quite a handsome fella in the 1860s in Sydney. He drove what was called a handsome cab, actually, horse and cart, and he ferried quite important people around the city. He'd even taken Prince Alfred for a journey into the darker, seedier parts of Sydney when he was out here. And unfortunately, one day in the late 1860s, a horse had lashed out and connected its hoof with his face and wiped his nose out. And so he was left with just a gaping hole where his nose should have been. So in the great Australian tradition, he was called Nosy Bob. And he was a figure of ridicule, loathing and contempt all around Sydney. Whenever he was a hangman, and executioners all over the world were reviled in public. If Nosy Bob went to have a beer at the local hotel, the publican would smash the glass after he'd finished his beer because he didn't want anyone else's lips touching that stained glass. His life was horrible, and yet there were two sides to him. He killed people for a living. He estimated the drop they required on the gallows, made sure the rope was always soaked and ready to go for the execution because he couldn't afford to have a mishap. And mishaps were quite a regular thing in executions in Australia. Anyway, on this day, 20th of January 1880, there were 5,000 people outside Darlinghurst Jail. It was enormous news all around the world. And they were trying to get a glimpse of this small courtyard where they were to be hanged. And Nosy Bob put the rope around Tom Rogan and around Captain Moonlight and gave the nod, and the trapdoor was pulled and they were sent plummeting to their deaths. Now, we know so many details about this extraordinary story, and particularly the relationship between Captain Moonlight and James Nesbitt, because in the weeks leading up to his execution, Moonlight sat in his death cell in Darlinghurst and wrote dozens of letters in this beautiful, immaculate hand of his to people all around the world, thanking them for the help they had shown him. He wrote to his parents. He wrote to James Nesbitt's mother and included a lock of James's hair in the letter. And he told her how much he loved her son, how both of them had promised each other that they would sleep with each other until eternity, or for eternity. He wanted to be buried in the same grave as James back in Gundagai, and he hoped that his final wish would be granted. We know all about this because those letters were never sent. They were seized by the jail authorities and they were filed away. And it wasn't until more than 120 years later when a couple of researchers stumbled across them in the archives, dusted them off, and found this trove of extraordinary letters. And when you read them, they're quite touching, and I quote quite a few of them at length in the book. He recites long passages of poetry when he wants to declare his love for James Nesbitt. And even at the time that men, this was an era, the Victorian era, when men quite often professed their love for each other in letters, but they were never detailed to the extent that we saw with Moonlight and Nesbitt. And you can actually see these letters. You can go to the State Archives down in Kingswood in Western Sydney. And it raises the hair on your neck. You have to put on white gloves and you sit there under a lamp and you turn the pages and you hold these pieces of paper that Captain Moonlight was pressing his fountain pen on 140 years earlier. And they're quite extraordinary. And you can see when he gets tired late at night, it's 2 a.m, he's got a candle burning or an oil lamp in his cell. And again, the handwriting starts weaving a little bit drunkenly and slanting to the right. So you know he was quite emotional. He defended himself during his trial and gave one of the finest speeches that had ever been heard in a courtroom as well. He was an extraordinary figure. And he was unlike, I guess, most of the bushrangers we had seen. I mean, most of them had been born in dirt floor shacks. Most of them were illiterate. They were revered. And I guess part of the reason I wanted to write this book was to sort of puncture, I guess, some of the myths around the bushrangers. And we all know the mythology that surrounded Ned Kelly, and I don't know if any of you have actually seen the true history of the Kelly gang, which was based on Peter Carey's outstanding novel from 20 years ago. But it came out late last year. You can see it on Stan, I think it's showing. It's an appalling, it's terrible. It's they cast a guy with short blonde hair. I mean, if you're going to do a movie about bushrangers, you've got to have a beard, please. But I wanted to sort of puncture a little bit of the mythology about these bushrangers, that they were these sort of revered as these mythic figures. And I think part of the reason for the mythology around them is that our white history has been so short. Overseas cultures have had their myths bestowed on. Aboriginal Australia obviously had its myths handed down over 80,000 or 100,000 years of existence here on this continent. But the Europeans had only been here for 90 years, 80 years. So there hadn't been enough time to develop the legends like Beowulf and Hercules and all of those other ones that other cultures had enjoyed. So the bushrangers were the closest thing that we had to them. And so the mythology sprang up around them. And I wanted to sort of take a look at that and sort of view it not just from the prism. I think there's always a danger when we look at the past through the prism of the present, but examined sort of why they were so popular for a time. And there is that sort of Irish sentiment, that rebelliousness that came with many of the convicts that sort of runs like a thread through many of the bushranging legends. People like Captain Thunderbolt, Mad Dog Morgan, and yet it all changed by the 1870s and 1880s. People were, apart from Kelly, people were sort of over them because they wanted to be seen as a more pristine, more mature society. And I guess that's where part of the issue with Moonlight sprang up and why he disappeared from our pages, because he was probably our only openly gay bushranger. And we're talking about a pretty prim and proper time, the Victorian era, where matters of sexuality were not discussed. They were certainly never discussed openly in the newspapers of the time. But when you go through, and I had to go through like thousands of pages for some of these newspapers, and boy, were they windbags back then. I spent 40 years as a journo and always trained to sort of write as tightly and concisely as you can. These guys just waffled on and on and on, and sometimes the sentences would run 400 or 500 words, dozens of commas thrown into the page like darts. And occasionally I would come across a letter to the editor or a small article that just hinted at the problem with Moonlight as they saw it at the time. And it was always because he was in association with other young men. And he had been in the dark recesses of these prisons where unspeakable acts were committed. And so you start looking at that and the evidence starts building up. And I think this is one of the reasons why Moonlight, because he was so unlikely and, he didn't really fit the model of a bushranger, because he was such a great public speaker and he was so well educated. He came from a very originally wealthy family. He didn't fit the mold, but also because of his relationship with James Nesbitt. I think that's why we saw historians of the time starting to push him out and just sort of erase him a little bit. He never completely disappeared, but he was a confusing character. He was hard to sort of describe. And I think that's why by the time the 1960s and 70s came around, and this is where I started, I was a young kid sitting there pouring through these bushranger almanacs and annuals. I never read that much about it. So look, I hope you'll find the time to take a look through the pages of Moonlight. To me, when I started writing it, I just finished a previous book on William Buckley, which I really enjoyed writing. He was a convict who'd been sent out to Australia in 1803 and escaped and ended up living with the Wadawurrung people in Victoria for 32 years and became quite a mythical character. And I just finished writing that, and I'd really enjoyed writing about him because I found him to be such a fascinating, and his journey had been so incredibly fascinating. And then I came up to Moonlight, and I found it hard to like the bloke. I sort of, he was mad and he was arrogant, and he was charismatic and he could speak on his feet. But I did fall in love with another character, and that was Nosy Bob. And I think it was probably out of sympathy with his plight and the way that he was treated. He was an underdog. And I decided to turn Nosy Bob into one of the key characters of the book, because to me, there are always echoes of history. And in the middle of 1879, 6 months before he carried out the execution of Moonlight, Nosy Bob was sent to the small town of Mudgee. And part of the reason why he was so loathed was that back in Sydney, there had been 10,000 people who marched in the streets to protest against the hanging that Nosy Bob had been sent to Mudgee to conduct. A young Aboriginal man called Alfred had been found guilty on very flimsy evidence of raping an older woman in Mudgee. And so they sentenced him to hang. Nosy Bob was sent out from Sydney to go and do the hanging. He had to go and catch a Cobb and Co coach and get through the mountains and then go through the bush to get there. Back in Sydney, 10,000 people had walked the streets, accompanied by the soundtrack of Handel's Death March. They used muffled drums. They were carrying candles, a lot like the Black Lives Matters protests that we're seeing today. And it was the start of a movement against capital punishment. People were starting to say it's a barbaric procedure, particularly for crimes not involving murder. And so they couldn't succeed in stopping the execution of Alfred. Nosy Bob handled that very well, actually. It was a very clean hanging, apparently, and he was very professional in the way he handled it. But I did feel a lot of sympathy for the Nosy Bob character, and then when you read the book, you'll find that he's threaded throughout it, because I wanted him to finally meet Moonlight, which he did on the gallows. They never said a word to each other, but for me, the stories of those two men were terrific examples of the changing social mores, I guess, of New South Wales, Victoria, and the colony of Australia at the time. So there's a lot of themes in the book, but essentially it's a yarn about, this mysterious Captain Moonlight and how he became, the biggest name in Australia at the time, and how very quickly he was erased from history's pages. So if you've got some questions, I'm more than happy to take them. And if not, I hope you'll go out and buy a copy. And if you have to, then go and borrow a copy from the library.
So we have it in the library. And I've started reading it, and I'm really enjoying it. And I really like the narrative that you use. It's not like a non-fiction book that you have to study at school. It's like you say, it's a story, and it's bringing the characters to life. So was that hard to switch, like to make it a narrative point of view rather than a non-fiction book?
Look, the easy thing to do if you're doing non-fiction is to put it all in past tense and throw thousands of footnotes in there, which I've got a real problem with footnotes. You need them in some form or another, I know that, but I always find them a real distraction, because you're either looking down the bottom of the page to find what the author's trying to explain, or they just slow the progress of the story. So I decided to do away with them, and I've kind of explained where I got all my sources at the end of the book anyway. And I've said if anyone's really interested and they're fascinated by some detail, I'll help them out and explain where I got it from. But I always had to make sure that I wanted to write the book as if it was almost like a movie, as if it was like a novel. And so I used the techniques of novels with subplots and bringing in extra characters. But everything is real in this. There's not one quote, not one fact that isn't sourced in some of the original source documents. It's either from the letters that Moonlight wrote from his prison cell, or from the newspapers at the time, and they were a tremendous assistance. And I don't know if all of you know about Trove. I'm sure you do, but it's one of the most, I think, undervalued and underappreciated resources in this nation. And you can find it by going to the National Library of Australia on their website. It's free, unlike everywhere else in the world where you have to go and look at digital newspapers online. Australia has opened it up to everyone, and they have digitised tens of thousands of Australian newspapers going back to the early 1800s. I think the first one's like 1804, 1805 from Sydney. And you can go through these pages, and that's where history really comes alive, because you start reading about people, you get the weather, you get the feel of the time, you look at the advertisements, and the snake oil solutions they had for so many of the problems back in the 19th century. You also get a feel for the tone of people and how they addressed each other. And look, it's not the overriding source documents, but they're an incredible insight into that time. And I had to go through thousands of these pages looking at Captain Moonlight, but also looking at the time around him. What other stories were captivating people? What were the issues of the time? There was a recession on that long walk from Melbourne to Gundagai. They would have encountered hundreds of itinerant workers who lost their jobs in Melbourne and Sydney, and were now roaming the countryside, going from one farmhouse to another, asking for food, asking for work. Many of them were embarrassed and humiliated by falling on such hard times. The politicians were under pressure, which helped explain why there was such a passionate need to conduct Moonlight's trial so quickly. It happened like 3 weeks after he was arrested. A full Supreme Court hearing, essentially over 4 days. So you can understand their attitude towards him, but you can also understand the attitudes of how people would have been thinking about a bearded bushranger who was passionately kissing the face of his dying friend, and why they were so close. And that's where things start to come alive. But you've got to read a lot. So you can go to Trove, you can just click a button on your computer and you can do a search, and it's all cross-referenced. You can just type in a name, you can find your forebears, your ancestors there. Mentions of them in local country newspapers. That's one of the joys I found, is not just big city daily newspapers that are selling tens of thousands of copies every day, but the very small regional newspapers who were sort of catering to small towns where there might have only been a couple of hundred people who would buy their product. And that gives you a sense too of Australia at the time, and these enormous changes that were taking place with the Industrial Revolution coming in. That the candles that people used to read by at night were disappearing and being replaced by kerosene lamps. And within 10 years, they were going to be replaced by the electric light, which was this stunning new invention that would transform the world.
So with all that research, even with the search functions of Trove, how long did it take you to pull it all together to write the book?
Look, I'm lucky because I do this full time now. So a lot of authors don't have the luxury that I had, and so I had a little over 12, probably 14 months. So I probably spent, I think, 3 to 4 months just reading and taking notes. And you start getting a little bit twitchy after that because, I'm a writer and I just love writing, but you've got to have the material first to work with before you can start shaping it. So, and to me, that was a very valuable time because it allowed me to think about how I wanted to structure the book. There's a million ways that you can write a book or tell a story. And I wanted to find a way that would probably try and widen the audience for something like this, that it wouldn't just be a normal work of non-fiction. I'm bored by non-fiction a lot of the time. I find it it reminds me of school textbooks. It takes me back to those history classes when I used to sit in the back of the class and throw wads of paper at the kids in front of me, not paying attention. And I wish people had have taught me history back then. The way I come across stories like, I'm not saying I'm any great history teacher, but if they have told me stories about William Buckley or Captain Moonlight and brought these people to life, then I think there would have been a greater capacity for a generation of Australians to probably show greater appreciation for their own history, rather than having this vanilla view of our settlement, the red coats of the Marines, the emergence of the colonies, federation. It's always been taught to us in a very dull and boring way. And I would have loved to have had someone standing in front of me telling me this story using Moonlight as a way to tell me that special time in Australian history and how this country was starting to grow up, and how, despite our horrible treatment of Indigenous people, that there was a growing awareness that it had been wrong and that we needed to atone for some of the mistakes of the past. That we also had our own rich European history, and that was nothing to be ashamed of either. So, hopefully books like this, and I just started working on another one, which I'm supposed to have finished by April next year, so it's out at about this time, which is also set in the dying years of the 19th century. Hopefully the last book I do in the 19th century, but it involves a bloke who was a suspect in the Jack the Ripper killings in England, who came out to Australia and basically continued his nefarious ways for some time until he was captured, and he was an enormous name. He made the front page of the New York Times during his trial. So I think the best way for us to pass on our own history and teach it and explore it with other people is to, a great story needs characters and it needs human beings. You can't tell history just through documents. You've got to bring people to life, and that's what I've tried to do with Moonlight. Whether or not I succeeded in doing it, I'll leave it up to you guys. You can have a read of it.
So you think it would probably go well in the school curriculum for history kind of thing for high school?
Look, I actually wrote it. Yeah, someone asked me that the other day, and I said, look, I'd love to see it get on the curriculum, not just because it would mean more copies sold, but because I think it's a great way to tell history. And, you know, I'd love to see it emerge there. I've started reading, I guess, a lot more non-fiction over the last 3 or 4 years than I had in the past. I've always liked books about politics and science, but and I've started looking at. But I guess one of the inspirations for me was, I don't know if you've read Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, which won the Booker Prize. It's a work of fiction. It's a novel, but it's based on Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell, who was his right-hand man for about 20 years and had to do all of Henry VIII's dirty work. And a lot of that novel is based on research. Beautiful book. And to me, it's a great way of telling history. Yes, she's embellished it. She's made up a lot of things there, but she also gives you a sense of time and place. You know, she tells you what they were eating, what colours of the fashion the women were wearing. And so to me, you know, if you can bring history to life, yeah, 3/4 of the way through there. I see someone's just put up a note saying Trove is brilliant. Recently, a filmmaker in Melbourne made a film about Stringy Bark Creek and the Callier murders. Your book sounds like it might make a fascinating film. I hope so, because the book I did on William Buckley, Buckley's Chance, we optioned the movie rights to that last Christmas, and I just had a chat to the producers yesterday, and they're now at the process where they're looking for funding, and they're looking at various directors to do that. It'll take a while, I think, because of COVID-19. It's sort of held up a lot of projects. But I've done the first draft of the film script for them. So that was about 50,000 words. And that was a lot of fun because I could take a book that I'd written that was purely based on fact and it never strayed into fiction. But because it's a movie, you get to make up a few more things. You can give him a love interest, because you've got to have a love interest in a movie. So I had a lot of fun with that. So I'd love to see Moonlight become a movie too. To me, it's got all of the ingredients, particularly, I'm not too sure. We've got a question here that did Nosy Bob hang Jimmy Governor? I think Jimmy was hanged in, I think it was one of the last so-called of the Bushrangers hanged, and that was about 1903 or 1902. I'd have to check that. I'm not too sure. But there is a real thread, as this person has said, thank you for that, a thread that runs through Nosy Bob and his hanging of so many famous figures. Someone said to me the other day, I want you to do a book about Nosy Bob. I think I'd love to, but I've almost had enough writing about people putting ropes around other people's necks, and it's pretty gruesome stuff to go through all of the time. So I might put that on the back burner and look at it again down the track. Anyway, if there's no more questions, I wanted to thank you very much for your time. I mean, I obviously love talking about Moonlight. I love talking about history, and because I get enthusiastic about the whole process. I love discovering things. This morning I was on Trove, and someone just recently said that Thomas Keneally wrote about the chant of Jimmy Blacksmith. I've read that. It's a terrific book, 1900 to 1901. Spot on. I think I have to check on Nosy Bob there. He actually hanged a woman, and I've just forgotten her name, but she was the subject of a recent book. It was one of the most famous hangings in Sydney, and he botched it. It didn't go very well. There's a real technique, obviously, but let's not go into the gruesome details. They're all there in Moonlight. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. And everybody, you can get copies of Moonlight through the library service and Buckley's Chance as well too. Or if you know someone who would like to read it, or you'd like it for your own personal collection, make sure that you check out the independent booksellers on the Central Coast who've been very supportive of the library events over the years. And I'd just like to say a big thank you to Garry. The talk has been mesmerising, and we wish you all the best with getting it out there and your new book. We look forward to seeing it next year.
Thank you, everyone, and hopefully, if you see me, and I'm pretty hard to miss. I'm about 6'4" and obviously bald. So if you see me hanging around the local libraries, I live here on the Central Coast, and I have no intention of ever leaving. Let me tell you, it's been a wonderful place to write books from. So thank you very much. Hope to see you all soon.